Season 5, Episode 26, Black History Moments is a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of those who have been forgotten or who are lesser known in our history. But as you all know, this month, the focus for Black History Month on the podcast is to shine a light on HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. Last week, our episode was on my alma mater, Florida A&M University, but before there could be a FAMU, there had to be an HBCU to lay the foundation for those that will follow. This week, we dive into the Lincoln University. Chartered in 1854 after James Amos, a freed Black man, was denied entry into white schools, he approached a reverend who took it upon himself to educate James and to also open the first degree-granting institution for African Americans. This is the story of Lincoln University. One day in 1852, a young Black man named James Amos, who was a freed, previously enslaved person, approached Reverend John Miller Dickey in Oxford, Pennsylvania. Now, Reverend John Miller Dickey was a white Presbyterian minister who, in addition to his preaching, was a part of different abolitionist groups and played an active hand in the anti-slavery agenda of the time. Knowing this about him is important because it helps us to kind of understand his headspace and what he stood for in his life. So James Amos approached Reverend Dickey because he needed help. And the problem that he was facing was that he wanted to go into the ministry, but he needed a college education or an education in general to do so. Although Oxford, Pennsylvania was above the Mason-Dixon line, there were still colleges in the area that would not accept him because he was a Black man. Reverend Dickey listened to James, he heard his story, he heard him out, and he thought, hey, we should do something about that. And the something, in this case, became persuading the state of Pennsylvania to charter the first Black institution for higher learning in the United States. But let me be clear, Lincoln University wasn't technically the first HBCU. That school was Cheyney University, which had been founded some years prior. However, Lincoln University was the first HBCU to grant degrees. And I'll kind of clear up the relationship between Cheyney and Lincoln University being the first HBCU because I know how we can get about our schools. We'll dive into that a little bit later. But Lincoln University was the first HBCU to grant degrees. So 2 years after Reverend Dickey was approached by James, he, along with his wife, her name was Sarah Emlyn Cresson, successfully founded the Ashman Institute with its charter on April 29th, 1854. Now, originally, Lincoln University was approved as, quote, an institution to be called Ashman Institute for the scientific, classical, and theological education of colored youth of the male sex. So it was a theology school for Black men. In other words, it was originally founded to train and educate Black men in theology, where they would then take that training and go back to Africa to spread the word. When the school first opened its doors, it had 4 students and 1 professor. I know we often hear about the safety of the North for Black people back then, but being in a northern state didn't necessarily mean that you were safe from bigotry and racism. At one point, Reverend Dickey had to mortgage his house to save the school, and also the struggling campus was constantly harassed by white raids from Maryland. However, if there is one thing people had back in those times, it was perseverance in the darkest of days. So not even raids were going to stop the institute from functioning. According to an article from the Pennsylvania Library, quote, the education the university provided to these African American males was strongly rooted in the teachings of the Presbyterian Church. In the university's early days, the Presbyterian Church associated with the school appointed the trustees and faculty of the university. And a majority of the early alumni entered the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist ministries, with many of the university's students becoming missionaries in Africa. Christianity was embedded into the daily life of faculty and students at the university. Students were required to attend morning and evening prayers, sermons on Sunday, with optional noon prayer meetings. Now, though religion was a significant part of life at the university, all students were accepted regardless of their religious knowledge, so there was no prerequisite to entry into the school. Throughout the students' course of study, the Bible was used as a textbook. Though the university is officially non-denominational today, the presence of religion is still felt on campus with an active chapel and numerous religious groups for students. After the Civil War, the Ashman Institute was renamed in honor of President Abraham Lincoln and also his issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, by the way, we do have a podcast episode on the history of Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation if you would like to listen to that. But the school is renamed in his honor and it becomes Lincoln University on April 4th, 1866, as President Lincoln had been assassinated the year prior to this. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, millions of previously enslaved people were freed, which meant that there was an increasing demand for the preparatory program offered at Lincoln University. Now, going back to that article before, quote, with more African Americans eager and able to obtain an education, Ashman Institute was rendered insufficient. Lincoln University was then developed in order to provide greater services while still meeting Ashman Institute's original goal of providing African Americans with higher education. The amended charter of 1866 gave more power to the university. The Board of Trustees increased in size from what was previously 9 people to 21 people. The maximum property holding rights and the freedom to confer degrees were increased. In its first graduating class, there was 1 student. In its second graduating class, there were 9. In its first 100 years, Lincoln University boasts graduating 20% of the United States African American physicians and 10% of the United States African American attorneys. Now, that is a big deal. In the first 100 years, for 10% of the entire country's attorneys to come from Lincoln University and 20% of the entire country's physicians to come from Lincoln University is a huge deal. Huge deal. Now, 2 particular names you may recognize as being graduates from Lincoln University are Thurgood Marshall and Langston Hughes. If you would like to hear a little bit more about Thurgood Marshall, you can listen to our episode with Daisy Bates. We talk about him in there. When Lincoln University celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1953, it celebrated by amending its charter to permit the granting of degrees to women. Because up until this point, the school has still been geared towards men. And in 1972, it formally associated the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a state-related co-educational university, being for men and women. Going back to that article from Pennsylvania Library, in 2013, the university underwent yet another name change. This time, the name was changed from Lincoln University to the Lincoln University. As part of an overall rebranding effort, the was added to the name in order to distinguish the school from several other Lincoln universities and colleges. In addition, the school feels that the adds emphasis to the university as the nation's first degree-granting HBCU. Again, there is some controversy over whether the Lincoln University or Cheney University is the first HBCU. Located less than 30 miles from the Lincoln University, Cheney University developed from the Institute of Colored Youth, founded in 1837. They were founded 20 years before Ashman Institute would even open its doors. However, the Ashman Institute graduated its first class in 1859, more than 60 years before Cheney University would become a college. So while Cheney University was around longer than the Lincoln University, Lincoln was the first to provide college-level education to African Americans, as the Institute for Colored Youth only offered a high school education until the 1920s. from the Lincoln University site. Quote, "Today, Lincoln's proud history informs our commitment to being a leading liberal arts school in our state and nation. Following the philosophy of our founders and the many students who pass through the halls, we take pride in challenging but supporting our students to be the best they can be and achieve more than they dreamed." Lincoln graduates continue to make names for themselves in the sciences, business, religion, law enforcement, and the creative and entertainment fields as writers, directors, comedians, and film executives. The reason I wanted to shine a light on the Lincoln University this month is because in order for barriers to be torn down, things have to start somewhere. And in this case, other HBCUs or historically Black colleges and universities today can be thankful to institutions like Lincoln University, where a freed man decided to ask a simple question about being educated when white institutions told him no. And for a reverend who stepped in and used his privilege to not only educate James Amos, but thousands more that would come after him. That brings us to the end of this episode. I hope that you share it with someone that you know, whether it be a coworker, friend, your auntie, your cousin, your neighbor down the street, maybe even a graduate of an HBCU. I hope that you remember that you too are Black history, and I'll see you in the next one.